So I'll continue from where we left off yesterday. We studied what Krishnaji had said about self-knowledge, investigated it, and saw the difficulties of perceiving what is, namely the fact, because the mind itself distorts, and it distorts because its conditioning contains a lot of illusions. And so the purpose of, or one of the purposes of self-knowledge is to clear up these illusions by discerning what is true and what is false. We went into that in quite a bit of detail, but there is much more to self-knowledge than that. Anything that one cannot learn from another or from a book is part of self-knowledge. So Krishnaji said, life is relationship, not only relationship to people and family and so on, but relationship to nature, to ideas, to religious beliefs, to our knowledge, to thinking, to our body, to pleasure, to imagination, and so on. And it is in that relationship that we can see our consciousness functioning. The relationship acts like a mirror, revealing to us how our consciousness is functioning, if we can watch it without distortion. And since thought is a colored instrument, he advocated passive awareness, because awareness doesn't have a content, it doesn't have a structure. What you see is the same as what I see, but your reaction to it may be quite different from my reaction to it, because my conditioning is different from yours. And so the interpretation given by our own mind is different from the factual. And therefore, one should not accept any opinion, neither your own opinion, nor your friend's opinion, nor your guru's opinion, nor Krishnamurti's opinion. Because opinion is just an idea about what that person thinks, including yourself. And what you think is not necessarily the fact. Therefore, you must doubt it, question it, and that's what it means to be free from one's conditioning. It's not the elimination of conditioning, it is elimination of the domination of that conditioning in your consciousness. Because you're not identifying with it and calling it the me. You are looking at it, and it's possible for us to look at it objectively after the mind has been freed of many of the illusions. That's the work we talked about yesterday. And it brings increasing clarity to the mind and therefore to perception. We said that just as the scientist has to make his lenses of his microscope achromatic and free from aberration, in the same way, we need to make our mind free from aberration so that it does not distort. Only then what you perceive is the truth, is what is. So truth here is not an idea. It is not a conclusion, not a logical conclusion. It comes into existence only when a consciousness perceives what is, namely the fact, without any distortion. And that's the difficulty of this quest for truth through self-knowledge. But as I said, there is much more to self-knowledge than that. And I want to take up some more things like what Krishnaji talked about, learning in the mirror of relationship. So if we look at our relationship with pleasure, is pleasure the same thing as happiness? Should I pursue it, or should I avoid it, abjure from it? If you play with this in your life, you will find that if you pursue pleasure too much, it goes wrong. If you suppress pleasure, avoid pleasure, also it goes wrong. So there is a right place in which you have to put pleasure in your life, not just form an opinion saying pleasure is evil, pleasure is good, and so on. Krishnaji called it the art of living. To put everything in its right place, that is the right value you attach to it. Not saying it should be there or it should not be there. That's just an opinion. Similarly, to find out the right place of knowledge requires us to investigate what knowledge can do, what thought can do, and where thought has no role and is dangerous to use thought. If you don't use thought where thought is needed, it goes wrong. If you use thought where thought has no role, also it goes wrong. So again, one has to learn this. Nobody else can teach you the right place of all these things. Imagination. You need imagination for planning, for doing research, for investigating. But imagination also can create illusions. And if you identify with them, it distorts, it divides. So one has to learn what is the right place of imagination and what is the wrong use of imagination, as also of thought, of knowledge, and so on. So Krishna suggested that since life is relationship, relationship to nature, to ideas, to religion, to people, all relationships. You can watch your consciousness, and if in that particular relationship there is conflict, then it's telling you that you are not approaching that relationship rightly. And the work to be done is to discover for yourself where you are giving too much emphasis to something or ignoring something which needs to be taken into account. So this work is the work of putting everything in its right place, which is what is order in consciousness. Otherwise, the conflict that arises, the negative emotions that come from it, create sorrow, create difficulty, and instead of being aware that we are ourselves creating the authors of our sorrow, we attribute it to others or to circumstances. And that itself is an error, an illusion. So self-knowledge also has this purpose. Another purpose of self-knowledge is to discover the right state of mind with which to approach any activity in life. In any activity in life, there is both technique and there is the spirit in which you must approach it. Take sports, we talked about. There is the technique of playing the game. You can learn that from books, from teachers, and so on. But there is the sportsman spirit, which demands that you approach it non-egoistically, for the love of it, for the joy of playing that sport, and don't emphasize the winning and the losing. We went into that last time, how when you approach it egoistically, it brings in all kinds of negative emotions into our consciousness and therefore into our game. So one has to come upon the sportsman spirit and not just the methodology or the skill of using the techniques. In art, the spirit of art is the sense of beauty, and that needs sensitivity. If one is not sensitive, one does not perceive beauty. And if you don't perceive beauty, what are you trying to express through the painting or the poetry or the sculpture? So the spirit is more essential than the technique. The technique is useful for expressing what the spirit is perceiving. But if the spirit is not there, it's wrong. The whole thing goes wrong. Similarly, in the form of government that we have, we want democracy. And democracy has both a spirit and a structure. Democracy is functioning together in society with all fellow citizens in a certain cooperative way to take decisions. So the structure is that you have elections of people who are nominated into the assembly, who frame the laws, which all the others then have to follow. Every 4 or 5 years, you have those elections and you vote representatives. And that election should be free from corruption and so on. It requires freedom of the press and the separation of judiciary from the executive, all of which we have in so-called democratic countries. But what is the spirit of democracy? And do we have the spirit of democracy? If you don't have the spirit of democracy, the structure doesn't create democracy. It goes wrong. Now, the spirit of democracy is one of humility, that none of us really knows what is the right way to live, to govern our society. So let's sit down and confer and listen to each other what we think are the problems that our society is facing. In listening to each other, we become more intelligent, more knowledgeable about it. Not forming opinions and contentions and arguing and so on, but just listening to each other, the different points of view, you become more knowledgeable about what people feel and what's going on in your society. There may be things which haven't occurred to you, which occur to the opposition or whatever, the other party people. Having so discussed, we then invite proposals for what laws to enact. And if more than one proposal comes forward, we vote and go by the majority view. And when we take that decision, everybody cooperates with that decision. Not saying, I was not of this opinion, therefore I will not cooperate. That's not democracy. That's not cooperative function. So the spirit of cooperative functioning is one of friendship, of sharing this responsibility of governing, of respecting each other's views, including those who are dissenting from the decision. But when the majority has taken a decision, we all cooperate in making it successful. And if problems arise, we repeat this whole process. We sit down again, we confer, we discuss. That's the spirit of democracy. What we find is that we have this structure in many countries, but almost no country has this spirit of democracy. They treat the opposition as rivals, as enemies. They don't respect each other. They use abusive language. They use falsehoods and propaganda, which means you don't really believe in the system which you are subscribing. And they use money power and muscle power to get votes. So you don't really believe in democracy, but you have the form of democracy. And therefore democracies don't really function as well as they can. In science, there is the method of science, and there is the scientific temper, the scientific spirit. The scientific spirit says we don't know what reality is. Not even physical reality about nature. We don't know what it is. Let us discuss, let us make proposals about what may be the reality, and then use the scientific method to test that proposal, whether it explains all observed facts or not. But if it doesn't, then we go back and consider again another model for reality. So again, it is a process of humility, it's a process of dialogue, and it's a process of experimentation and learning. And as soon as it is found that something is false, it is dropped. There is no attachment to the false. I wish it was the same with illusions. As soon as you discover that it's an illusion, if you could just drop it. But we are too attached to our illusions, and that's contrary to the spirit of the religious quest. So with these illustrations, I have just shown that the approach to an activity is more important than even the structure, the form, and the laws of that activity, the rules of that activity, because it determines what that activity will be like. And this is something one needs to learn, not just the technique. What you find is people are learning and stressing on the technique, but have lost the spirit of sportsmanship, of scientific temper, of art. And in religion, also there is the structure, the belief, the method of worship, the rituals, and so on. All that is the structure of that religion. But the spirit of that of religion is one of love, compassion, and non-violence. Again, we find that it's easy to practice the structure, but we don't have the religious spirit. And without the spirit, the structure, the technique becomes hollow, superficial. Doesn't serve the purpose. So that is a major problem in society. And mere belief or mere desire that it should go away will not bring about change unless we ourselves learn to come upon the right spirit in which to approach every activity in life. And of course, you will notice that life itself needs to be approached non-egoistically, because the ego will create division, will bring in violence, and so on. So one has to find out if there is an energy that is not derived from the ego. And Krishna ji calls that love. He says, yes, there is this energy of love. It is innately there in our consciousness, but we have not valued it sufficiently. We have valued the achievements of the ego, and we have promoted the ego, and the ego destroys the capacity for love. And that's why we have problems in all our relationships. Relationship to nature, to ideas, to religion, to people, to nationalism, all that. Pleasure. Problem is not with pleasure. Pleasure is a natural thing. You eat good food and it gives you pleasure. You have sex and it gives you pleasure. The problem is not with pleasure. The problem is with the demand for the fulfillment of that pleasure. It creates desire, which may also be natural, but you are not willing to let go. You are addicted to the fulfillment of that desire. That addiction is the ego. The pleasure is not the ego. So it is the stress on receiving for the self that converts an innocent pleasure into an addiction. It converts sexuality, which is a perfectly natural thing, into lust. All the time demanding that pleasure for oneself without caring for another. And that leads to all kinds of crimes, as we have seen. Now, nobody teaches us this. Our education doesn't even raise this question. Therefore, we just grow up and watch what is happening and perpetuate it, accept That's why our problems never end. Society has tremendous inertia because all our problems continue in the same way. You can multiply the examples for yourself. So, Krishnaji demands that we need a creative consciousness. A creative consciousness is not dictating from the past. It is open to change. It is willing to experiment. It's willing to find out what is right and what creates problems. And that's the learning process which is part of self-knowledge. So self-knowledge has all these purposes. The ending of illusions through discerning what is true and what is false. The putting of everything in its right place, that means determining its right value in our consciousness. And coming upon the right spirit in which to approach all activity in our life. And you will yourself find that so long as the approach is non-egoistic, it's healthy. And the moment it turns egoistic, it brings division and corruption and negative emotions and so on into it. So one has to ask the larger question of what is the self? And is it possible to free oneself from this self-centered process, which is freedom from the ego? And we'll take that up in another chapter, another talk, which is about the self. So all this is part of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is a vast field. It covers the whole of life, and it's at the root of this religious quest. Without that, there is no wisdom. There are all kinds of opinions, all kinds of illusions in the mind, all kinds of distortion in our perception. And therefore, we are not with the truth. And when you are not with the truth, you are not intelligent. Krishna says, there is no intelligence without compassion. He doesn't accept what society calls intelligence, which is ability and skill in performing some actions, as intelligence at all. Because even biologically, even by the definition given by Darwin, intelligence is that which leads to survival. And the kind of intelligence which we are using in society is producing nuclear power, producing this AI and chat AI and so on, which can be misused. And we have not learned how to use that. So we are not in quest of truth, we are in quest of power. Now that brings me to the question of why we live with belief. What is belief? And why we have so many beliefs? When do you believe? I don't have to believe that this is a talk going on internet. I know it. I see it. I don't have to believe that there is this light in front of me. I see it. So when do you believe? When you don't see. When you don't see and you don't know, why is it not enough to say, I don't know? Why do you have to believe? That's a question one must ask oneself. When you know, you don't need to believe. You believe when you don't know. You don't know what God is, so you believe some imagination about God. And since it is imaginary, since it's illusory, it is different for different people. We can imagine a different form of God. I can imagine a different form of God and call it my culture, he calls it his culture, and we get divided and we fight over it. So it's the height of stupidity. It's the most unintelligent way of living. But that's how we are living. So our sorrows, we are ourselves the author of our sorrows. Our society is the way it is because we are the way we are. And unless we change through self-knowledge, unless we transform this and come in contact with facts and what is and live with that, because facts don't divide. The fact is the same for you and for me. But my opinion about it may be different from your opinion. And the opinion comes from our conditioning. And our conditioning, we have gone into it. It depends on where you were born and brought up and what ideas you grew up with. And you haven't even examined whether that is true or false. So all that is, one has to learn that for oneself through doubt, through questioning, and free your mind of all this rubbish in condition. Krishna says, learning does not even begin until you free yourself of your condition. You can see the truth of that for yourself. Having done that, then there is this question of the art of living. I recall a conversation between Fritjof Capra, who wrote the book called Tao of Physics, which was perhaps one of the first books to talk about science and spirituality. He was at one time very interested in Krishnamurti's teachings, and he went to the talks Krishnamurti gave in Sane, probably in the 1960s and 70s. And he was very enthusiastic. So he went and asked Krishnaji, sir, do I have to give up my science in order to do what you are advocating? Krishnaji said, no, sir. But you are a human being first and then a scientist. So learn the art of living. Then do your science. Engage with self-knowledge, learn, come upon wisdom. Then that wisdom will put your science in its right place. Otherwise, the science itself does a lot of mischief because all knowledge, including scientific knowledge, generates power, ability. And power and ability are useful things, provided you use them constructively. But they are also dangerous things if they are used destructively. And to know what is the right use, what is the constructive use, needs a lot of wisdom, which comes from self-knowledge. Not through mere opinion or merely following some wise man. That's another illusion we have, that we can follow a particular religious man, a guru, or including Krishnamurti. You can't follow Krishnamurti because you don't have that consciousness, you don't have that wisdom which he had. So come upon wisdom, wisdom which Krishnamurti had. Our job is to come upon wisdom. Our job is, we can't follow another wise man. If you decide to follow Gandhi, you can dress like him, you can walk like him, you can eat food like him, and so on. But those were not the great things about Gandhi. He didn't hate his enemies. How will you overcome the hatred in your heart? That's not something you can do by will. So one has to investigate, find out where will can be used and where will has no significance. Because the will is the essence of the ego. And when will is used to follow ideas, and action is determined by the idea, you are conforming to a pattern given by the idea. That's not intelligence, that is not creativity, it is imitation. So merely to follow some idea, some ideology, like the communist ideology or the Marxist ideology or the capitalist ideology, creates division, creates violence, is an unintelligent response to life. So Krishnaji raises the question, can we live without belief, without ideology, without ideals, just live with the present and deal with the present through intelligence and wisdom, creatively, not imitating, not repeating, not simply following tradition. Otherwise, we become like tape recorders, repeating what other people have said, without coming upon wisdom. So he says, repetition of a truth is a lie. If you have perceived that truth, then you have the truth. But if you are merely repeating what somebody else has perceived, it's a lie. It's not true. So he said, don't speak about something which you have not perceived for yourself. Of course, in the field of knowledge, it is okay. But in the field of self-knowledge, it has no value. Field of knowledge is a field of ideas. And you can have debates, and you can have dialogues, and you can do analysis and so on. All that has value in that field to generate more knowledge and so on. But as we have pointed out, knowledge does not transform consciousness. It's only intellectual property. If you're interested in that game, do it. But it's also dangerous if you don't know its limits. And to find the limits is wisdom. Tagore gave a beautiful metaphor for this balance that is needed in life. He said, the waters of the river must be free to flow. But if they don't respect the banks, they shall never get to the sea. So everything has its utility and its limits. To be aware of those limits is wisdom. And to function within those limits out of wisdom, not out of will, is right living. That is the art of living. But we have not been encouraged to learn this art. We haven't taught the techniques of painting or sculpture or poetry and so on. So we have divided it up without coming upon the spirit of art, namely the sensitivity which brings perception of beauty into consciousness. And beauty is there in every relationship, in every activity in life, if we are sensitive to perceiving it. It's there in music, it's there in art, it's there in sports, it's there in science and mathematics, it's there in history and whatever, academics. Beauty is the joy that you experience in engaging in that activity, not the joy of achievement, or praise or popularity and so on. That's a pleasure. The joy is intrinsic to that activity. It's not a reward from that activity. The fame, the name, the money you get is all a reward for engaging in that activity. So you must distinguish between joy and pleasure or achievement. All this is part of self-knowledge, and the learning of this is essential for being wise in one's life. Without it, things will inevitably go wrong because you're carrying on with your own thought world, your own illusions. You're not in touch with reality. And so it goes wrong. And we merely perpetuate opinions, traditions, which means we perpetuate all our problems. And that's what produces all this inertia in society. Krishna says when you are functioning with an idea, it's a desire process because you are wanting to achieve that, what that idea is saying. And you're giving importance to achievement, not to learning, not to discernment of what is true and what is false, but to achievement. And that is the ego process. So it will have all the dangers of the ego. That's why freedom from the ego, which means freedom from self-interest, dominating in the consciousness, is essential. The other day, someone asked a question, whether there is no role for the ego or the self. There may be a small role, but find out how far that extends, and when it goes beyond that, it goes wrong. For instance, you do need to have physical security. You do need to look after the body, to have means of feeding yourself, your family, and so on. So there is need, and then there is greed beyond that. And to be aware of this border, because need is right, but greed is part of the ego. Just as we said, pleasure and lust, the borders between them. Who's going to tell you where to draw that line? You will have to learn through your own experimentation in life what is the right place and when you are putting it in the wrong place. When you put it in the wrong place, it will create conflict, it will create disorder in consciousness, which is very perceptible. There are many subtle things in this understanding. For instance, one talks about freedom from sorrow. Now, sorrow is both personal sorrow, the sorrow of your loss, the sorrow of self-pity, and so on, which is egoistic. There is also the sorrow of compassion. You don't want to throw that away. You feel sorrow for a human being who is suffering when you see him, when you come in contact with him. That's part of sensitivity. So if you don't discern the difference between that sorrow and the personal sorrow, you just conclude that sorrow is stupid. You may throw away the baby with the bathwater. That's why this understanding of self-knowledge is very subtle, and that's why you need to remain with the question for a long time and keep perceiving, not make conclusions, add them to your knowledge and live with that knowledge. Krishnaji points that out, that you are willing to reconsider, look at it again, afresh. You're not living on the conclusions of yesterday's inquiry. That's what a creative consciousness means. And the greatest human beings amongst us have been those who have walked out of their past. The Buddha walking out of Hinduism, Jesus Christ walking out of Jewish notions, Socrates walking out of his past, and so on, others. So find out if you can hold the past and the memories of the past lightly and drop them the moment you discern that they are creating complications in your perceptions in life. Thank you. I think I'll end it here and we can have some discussion.
Thank you, Professor Krishna. I will read the first question from Vanaparti. Is creative consciousness intelligence?
Yes, as Krishnaji defines it. As he defines intelligence, there is no intelligence without compassion. And compassion comes from wisdom. So wisdom, the capacity to perceive what is without any distortion, all that is both intelligence and wisdom. So you may use the word wisdom because the word intelligence has got a very different meaning in society. But Krishnaji, the way Krishnaji uses the word intelligence is the same as the word wisdom.
Now we have a question from Prasad Kongara. Is the pursuit of balance inherent in the art of living?
Yes, as we mentioned, you need to know these boundaries between the normal, natural process and the egoistic process. Where does need end and greed begin? Where does wish end and desire begin? Where does natural sexuality end and lust begin? So you have to watch it where you are treading from the normal, natural happening into the ego field. It's the ego field that is the psychological field. And as soon as the human consciousness enters into that psychological field, all the complications arise. That's why those complications are not there in animals. They live only with nature. They don't have all this measurement, comparison, judgment, and imagination and all that. So they live without the ego problems. Human beings have this problem, and therefore we need self-knowledge. We need to understand the tiger doesn't need self-knowledge.
And now the second part of Prasad's questions. Does making choices necessarily lead to conflict? If that is the case, how can one navigate this conflict while still attaining balance?
No, you need to watch when choice is being made egoistically, it's corruption. And it will have the consequences of corruption, which is a negative emotion. When choice is a requirement, it's not corruption. It's not coming from the ego. For example, you have to appoint a teacher in your school, and there are 5 different candidates. You have to talk to them and so on. You will have to make a choice between them. When somebody offers 5 different sweets on a plate, you don't pick up all the 5 saying, I'm not allowed to choose. So wisdom tells you where choice is useful and necessary and where choice has no meaning. So in this learning of self-knowledge, Krishna talks of choiceless awareness, because choice brings in the observer, the preference of the observer, and you are trying to observe what is taking place objectively without distorting it, and your choice will distort it. So that's why he talks of choicelessness. Doesn't mean all choice is evil and all choice should be avoided. That's one of our conditionings, that we are constantly, from childhood, we have been trained, conditioned to think in terms of what I should do and what I should not. And we try to do the same with Krishnaji's teaching. We read Krishnaji's teaching and then make our own morality that I should not do this, I should do that. That I should not think, I should not use knowledge, I should not read sacred books, I should not go to the temple. He has never said that. There is nothing in Krishnamurti saying, do this, don't do that. On the contrary, he has said, sir, come upon love and then do what you will, it will be right. Now, love means no self-interest. If you're living without self-interest, your motivation is not governed by self-interest, do what you will, it will be right. You can go to the temple. Don't approach the temple egoistically. You can read a book. Don't read it egoistically, not for acquiring Nobel Prize, just for the joy of it. And it is part of love, it's not part of ego. So it's very subtle, and it depends on your motivation, the way you approach that activity or approach life. The ego comes in the approach, in your state of being. It's not there in the activity.
Next, we have a question from Salvador Rojas. Is consciousness independent of spirit? And is intelligence what allows us to understand spirit?
No, I'm using the word spirit. You know, these words have not been very precisely defined as we define terms in science. So different people use these terms with different meanings. And so even the same person uses this same term with somewhat different meaning in different contexts. So that's why it's not important to give, it's not valuable to give a lot of importance to the meaning of a particular statement, but to ask yourself, is this what it means and is that true? And then observe in your daily life in the mirror of relationship to find out whether it is true. That's the process of self-knowledge. But we like to do only intellectual analysis, and it's a very limited activity. The intellect is just one fragment of our being. And we have given tremendous importance to the intellect, and that itself becomes a lopsided functioning in life. It has its right place, intellect, and putting it in its right place is part of the art of living. Not that you should discard the intellect. There is nothing that is completely unnecessary, and there is nothing that is completely heavenly God, God given. You have to find that out for yourself.
And now we have a question from Kusrav Rasban. What prevents perception?
We said that, no, in the first talk where we talked about illusions and all the negative emotions which come from various illusions, how they color our perceptions. And so that's what blocks true perception. False perception goes on all the time. For instance, a father who has been deceived in love by somebody can tell his son, beware of women, they are untrustworthy. He's just generalizing from his experience and perpetuating his illusion into the mind of his child without knowing that he is doing that. He thinks it is wisdom, he's passing on wisdom, but he is passing on a prejudice. And that's the danger. That's what spoils perception. So our knowledge, our opinions distort our perception. Not all knowledge and all opinions, but find out which opinions distort and beware of them.
Next, we have a question from Hareshwar Singh. Krishnamurti avoided using the word wisdom and preferred the word intelligence, the awakening of intelligence. Are both these the same?
I think I just answered that question in the very first question that you asked. The sense in which Krishnaji uses these words, intelligence is what we call wisdom.
And next we have a question from David Moody. Dr. Krishna, in your talks, you distinguish sharply between the quest for truth and the activity of the self. But in daily life, that distinction may not be so clear. For example, we may consciously want to discover truth, but underneath, there may be the urge to become someone who has discovered truth. So isn't that distinction difficult to discern in daily life?
It is difficult, but if you are having a learning mind, you are watching, you are alert, you know that there is a lot of self-deception in this field, and so you are not trusting your own perceptions and your conclusions, you are doubting them. And so such a mind is unlikely to get crammed in this problem. But normally we are not alert, we are not discerning. We go by certain authority, the authority of one's own experience or one's own opinions, or the authority of some guru, and so on. So then there is no intelligence. And when there is no intelligence, one is completely gullible. It will go wrong. So it is difficult, but the difficulty is coming from our own lack of clarity. Also the lack of honesty. If you have to watch very honestly, you will know. But the mind tends to favor the first person singular and say, I'm not like that. All these tendencies one has to watch. The ego is a very devious, deceptive creature.
And next is the last question we currently have. So just wanted to mention that if anybody would like to post more questions, feel free to do so. So this question is from Raju. Since pleasure is so addictive, what is the means to end the addiction?
You have to watch as soon as the demand for that pleasure is becoming obsessive. You are entering the zone of addiction. But so long as you can experience that pleasure and then leave it, and it does not affect your happiness, if you don't get it, you're free. Then it's innocent. So you have to watch that. How does a man get addicted? You have to watch that. To begin with, he was not addicted. Let's take the example of smoking. His friends are smoking and they give him a cigarette and say, oh, come on. And he has been told, no, it's a bad habit. I don't want to go into it. They laugh at him and they say, you're chicken. We are all smoking and nothing happens. You are just too scared. So he's prompted into proving that he is not scared, he is brave. And in order to impress them, he starts smoking. In the first instance, it is unpleasant to him. He coughs and throws it away and so on. Then they call him a chicken. They say, you have given up, you are not. So he takes more. And in competition with them, slowly the chemistry builds up in his body and the body starts demanding that pleasure of a cigarette. And if he doesn't get the cigarette, he feels uncomfortable and lost. If he is watchful, if he is alert, he can notice that I am beginning to get addicted. I'm beginning to develop attachment to this pleasure. And when he knows that that is dangerous, he can easily desist from it. It's like a forest fire. The forest fire starts as a small little fire. Somebody throws a cigarette in the forest and it catches fire. If he's alert, he notices the fire, he can stamp it out with his foot. But when he's not aware, not alert, it increases, becomes a big forest fire. And the entire fire department is there trying to put it out and they are not able to put it out. So that's a metaphor, but that's how this pleasure grows into you. Starts with a natural urge to have pleasure. So watch it. The moment you are not able to do without it, it is telling you you are getting addicted. If you are watchful, you can stop easily. But we are not aware of this. We are not taught this. So we continue with the pleasure till it turns into an addiction. And then the whole of Alcoholics Anonymous finds it so difficult to help this man come out of that problem. So that is the whole mechanism by which this thing builds up. And it's because of lack of awareness, lack of alertness, that we enter into this danger zone. But it doesn't mean that pleasure itself is the problem, but the demand for the fulfillment of your pleasure is addiction. Watch that. That is the ego. So the addiction comes from the ego. The pleasure may be a natural thing. The same with sex. It may be quite a natural thing. It's there in animals, it is there in plants, it is there in us. When you are close to somebody of the opposite sex, the desire for sex may arise. If it can be fulfilled with no harm, no hurt, no danger, no violence, there's nothing wrong in fulfilling it. But if it can't, if you find that she is not willing or she is already married or whatever, why can't you let go? So it is important to let go when you see that it's going to be harmful. And when you are not able to do that, that is the violence and that is the ego process. So you have to be watchful, mindful, and alert. And those boundaries, if you have worked with them, they are very noticeable. But because we don't work on them, because we don't learn about them, we cross the boundary and then it's too late.
Now we have a question from Narendranath. What is the difference between intellect and intelligence?
Intellect is usually the result of knowledge and experience. Experience also creates knowledge. That means it is held in memory. And then the clever use of that memory to do things is the job of the intellect. It is also called intelligence in the normal world, but not in the sense in which Krishnamurti uses the word intelligence. That intelligence which we use in the normal world is just ability. It's very intelligent in working with computers or in painting with brushes and so on. A very intelligent person, capable person. It's only in one particular field that that intelligence manifests. But Krishna is talking about intelligence which includes compassion and so on, akin to wisdom. So wisdom is quite different from intellect because wisdom is not dependent on knowledge. It is this ability to discern what is true and what is false. To be aware of those borders between what is natural and what is egoistic. To know what is biological and when you are entering into the psychology. For example, fear. Fear can be biological. The fear of large sounds, the fear of a dangerous animal, the fear of the dark, it is there. Biological fear. It has been put there by nature for protection of the body of the individual. But there are also psychological fears. What will happen to me in future? The fear of future insecurity drives you money to collect that you will never experience poverty and you will have. It brings its own consequences. You have to be guarding your property and so on. So you become part of a slave of that property. So all this is part of that learning of self-knowledge. So intelligence is quite different from intellect.
And now Ravi G asks, what to do with this wandering mind, not letting concentrate or attend anything, any talk, book completely?
You have to watch the wandering without objecting to it and discover the causation underneath. So long as the causation is there, the wandering will take place. What we want is that the effect should disappear without our eliminating the causation. And what Krishnaji is pointing out is, it's a law. You have to deal with the causation. And if the causation is dissolved, then the effect automatically disappears. And that is the real change. The rest of it is only control. And control produces conflict between what you are and what you should be. So that's not a religious life. Religious life is freedom. Freedom means no conflict. No conflict between what is and what should be.
Next, we have a comment from Hareshwar Singh, and I will turn it over to Professor Krishna to see if you have additional comments. I wonder if David meant by quest of truth, the truth about which Kay maintained that truth is a pathless land. If I discover the truth of my being competitive, that is also one of the simple truths about me.
Yeah, we discussed this in a previous talk. We said there's not only one truth to be perceived. Every illusion, corresponding to every illusion, there is the truth to be perceived, which will end that illusion. So this quest for truth is a quest for ending illusion. Now, if you can end one illusion, potentially you can end all illusion. But it's not a linear process. You don't have to end one illusion after another. It's like a quantum process. If you are watching, you might not have to go through all the small illusions before you come to the big one. You may be able to uproot the entire ego process if you perceive the danger. But we don't perceive the danger, then it doesn't end. It will go on. Your opinion that it should not be there, that it is dangerous, doesn't act. But your perception of that danger will act.
And now we have a question from Karthik. What is the purpose of creating human beings attached with so many things so strongly? Attached with so many things so strongly?
That is just a part of nature. A male and a female animal or human being come together, have sex, and an offspring is born. Because the human offspring needs to be not only looked after for 3 months or 6 months, but for 20 years, because it has this whole development of consciousness and so on, which needs to be guided. That's why human beings have created the institution of marriage and family, because no one has found a better way to bring up a child than for these two individuals who produce that child to accept the responsibility of creating a home and raising this child for those 20 years till he can function independently in society. But it's a man-made institution. Very few animals have marriage. They have attachments, but they don't have marriage in the way we have, no laws governing it. And that's a social structure which human beings have created, and that is the purpose of it. Not always it works. The couple have their own egos, and therefore they can come to loggerheads with each other and want to separate. So then this system breaks down. The children suffer, they are innocent, but they suffer in this process. So that's why it is important to understand relationship and how conflict arises in relationship, and to understand how the ego creates this division and solidifies it, so that two people who were great friends and living together happily turn against each other and become enemies of each other, standing in a court of law, demanding compensation and so on. So it's a whole process, and you have to free your mind of that process. The beginning of that process itself needs to be checked, which requires this freedom from the ego and the understanding of what really love is. Because love is freedom, and love is intelligence, and love is wisdom. All these words, if you go very deep into it, they become one and the same thing.
Now I will read part 1 from Chandra about belief. It seems K undermines belief. For example, I need to believe religion is love, compassion, and non-violence. If one denies or doubts this belief of religion, how would he or she discern?
I don't think that is really a belief. It's more or less the definition of religion and virtue. That you come upon love, compassion, and wisdom, this kind of intelligence of self-knowledge. The only thing is, there's a lot of illusion about how you can get there. So different religions have prescribed different paths, thinking that the path will take you there. And Krishnaji has pointed out that the path will not take you to wisdom, because it needs a more creative perception. It is not enough to follow some formula. It needs a creative perception. So that's why it is pathless, because creativity is pathless. Tradition has a path. Imitation has a path. The ego tries to find a path whereby it can become something. But creativity is not born of paths. It is out of the box thinking. How the human mind comes upon creativity is a great mystery. Even philosophers and thinkers and scientists have found it difficult to understand how insight occurs in human consciousness, bringing something which is completely outside the known into the field of the known, whether in science or in art or in music or in religion. How does the human mind make a foray into the unknown, pick up a truth, and bring it into the known, field of the known? We still don't know. But that capacity is there in the human being, and it's connected with this other qualities of awareness, choicelessness, silence, and so on. It's not a thought faculty. Thought can create the question, but it can't create insight. That's what distinguishes us from computers. Computers have memory. Computers can think. Computers can calculate and add faster than human beings can. But they are not creative. They are not aware of what they are doing. They are mechanical. Of course, now they are talking about artificial intelligence and so on, which I don't fully understand. So they are trying to put that kind of capacity into a computer, create robots which will be like human beings. So I don't know, but the scientists themselves are divided about it. Roger Penrose, who is one of the top mathematicians and scientists from Oxford, who has written a lot of books about this, thinks that you can never create awareness in a computer. It can think, it can calculate and so on, but awareness is a different dimension. And it is there in the human consciousness. It's not, cannot be there in a computer. Not other scientists don't agree with him, but they are doing experiments to find out whether the computer brain can simulate the human brain.
And the second part, belief with reasoning and experience is different from blind belief, right?
When it is connected with reason and perception, then we call
Sir, you are not audible.
me.
Now audible, sir. Please
Okay,
continue.
not audible. Maybe the computer is trying to tell that talk is going on too long.
Possible, sir.
We should listen to it and stop it.
That demonstrate how very hot it is. Maybe.
Yeah, I think there was a message here saying your internet connection is unstable. So that's what is happening. Maybe it's time to end it and we meet on next Saturday and continue. If you are not
Now it's
satisfied.
stable. Right now it's stable, sir. You may continue.
Okay.
Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
And this is currently the last question, and already. Belief with reasoning and experience is different from a blind belief, right?
Yeah, it's not a blind belief, but it is in the area of faith. And faith can also be mistaken. So you have to watch what is the consequence of it. If there are no negative consequences, it's the innocent. But if it is producing negative consequences like division between human beings or violence or opinions which antagonize one person from another, then there is an element of ego behind it. Ultimately, as Krishnaji has said, the test is in watching your consciousness. If there is disorder arising in the consciousness, you have to learn about it through watching and free yourself of that disorder. And this is not a process that ends. It's a continuous process because the disorder can arise again because the ego can form again. What the ego requires, and we are going to go into it in detail in another chapter, is the instinct of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, which is there. It's an instinct, it is there in animals, it is there in us, biological. In us, it also becomes psychological. That is the additional problem for a human being. Psychological pleasure and psychological pain. Memory and imagination. These three things enable the ego to form. We'll go into it in great detail, how the ego forms and what one can do to free oneself of this process. And whether that process serves some purpose up to a certain age in our development. These are important questions also in the field of education.
So maybe I would like to turn it over to the organizers to see if there are any additional things they would like to mention.
Not really, sir. We perhaps have come to the end of our session today, maybe another couple of minutes or so. As Professor Krishna already mentioned, probably it's a good idea for us to, at this point in time, close today's session, and then we will reconvene in 6 days. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Professor Krishna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Thank you very much.